afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's morning here on the East Coast in the United States. I'm Ben Hopkins, the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, and welcome to our next installment in New Books in Asian Studies. Today we have a really fantastic guest, Wazhmah Osman, who's at Temple University, professor of media studies, who is going to talk about her new book on the media landscape in Afghanistan, just out with University of Illinois Press. Before we get going, I have a couple of housekeeping issues to take care of, a couple of reminders and a couple of thank yous. First, to begin with the latter, the thank you. In addition to the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, today's program is also sponsored by the Institute for Global Diplomacy, for Public Diplomacy and Global Communications. And Janet Steele, the director of that program, is in our audience today. So thank you so much, Janet, for co-sponsoring this with us today. And I think it's really germane to today's topic. With regard to today's presentation, a couple of quick ground rules. This is being recorded and we will post this on YouTube once we get the video cleaned up. This is supposed to be an interactive conversation between myself and Wazhmah. Don't worry, I won't talk that much because this is really Wazhmah's show. This is really an opportunity for her to share what is an incredible piece of work with us all. But it's also an interactive opportunity. And so for the audience members, on the right-hand side of your panel, you will see two options. You'll see one for chat and one for Q&A. If you have any questions you would like to pose to the author, please put them in the Q&A box on your right-hand side. Include whatever identification you can, please, your name and if you have an affiliation, where you're coming from. And I will be sure and integrate your question into this morning's conversation. The last thing I'd also like to remind everybody is, in keeping with our tradition here at the Sigur Center on the New Books for Asian Studies, we will have our usual book giveaway. So anybody who asks a question will be automatically registered for the book giveaway to receive today's volume in a follow-up. So do definitely put in your name and details and keep your questions coming. That should take care of the housekeeping issues. So let's turn to the matter at hand this morning. As I said, Wazhmah Osman is a professor of media studies at Temple University. She has a PhD from NYU. She's written a number of really fantastic pieces on the mediascape and also on kind of what I would characterize as a post-colonial critique of the American intervention in Afghanistan. Today's topic is her new book, on the Afghan mediascape, which is just out with the University of Illinois, and it's a really wide-ranging piece of scholarship that not only engages the mediascape, but engages gender, feminist critique, issues of ethnicity, which really mark the contemporary cultural and political topography of Afghanistan. So I think we're in for a real treat this morning with Wazhmah's discussion. And I myself am greatly looking forward to it. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started. Wazhmah, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's really exciting to talk to you about, as I mentioned in my email, a book I thoroughly enjoyed reading over the weekend. It's just really a wonderful piece of scholarship.
Thank you so much, Ben, for having me. I want to also make a couple of thank yous, starting with Ben himself for inviting me to be a part of this book series sponsored through the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at GWU. I attended Ben's wonderful book talk earlier in the year, his book, Ruling the Savage Prefree, Frontier Governance in the Making of the Modern State. And I've been a fan of his work, and it's been influential to me. And we both, I would say, have a similar post-colonial and revisionist critique of the failed state narratives. Granted that we have different methodologies, his is historical and mine is ethnographic, but it's a delight to be in conversation with you. So thank you for inviting me. And I also want to thank Miriam Greenberg, Yasmin Sadoudi, and others at the Sigur who've done a wonderful job organizing this. Additionally, I want to thank the co-sponsors, Dr. Janet Steele from the Institute of Public Diplomacy and Global Communication for co-sponsoring. So I'm excited to be here and have this conversation with you all.
Great. It's always good to be in conversation with a fellow traveler, as it were. So to start off, Wazhmah, can you just tell us a little bit about how you came to this project and more generally, why did you write this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it's something I've gone back to because it's been a project that's taken me on a long journey. And it all started, I would say, post 9/11. And at that point, I was not in grad school yet. I was a filmmaker and a journalist. After the events of 9/11 and the attacks on the World Trade Center and all the other aspects of it that we know, there was a slew of public discourse, I would say, on Afghan culture. In a way, I would say the Western spotlight turned to Afghanistan and Iraq. And then with more at that time, I would say Afghanistan, and the culture and the history of the country was dissected. And what I noticed was that there was so many problematic representations of the culture, things we've talked about before, Ben, in terms of the people being categorized as backwards and barbaric and so forth. And another classic trope, of course, being stuck in time. And so shortly thereafter, I started my master's program. This was before I went on to my PhD. I wanted to ask these questions about, how Afghans themselves, think about these issues of cultural progress and issues of nation building, and also what they think about and how they talk back to this dominant discourse from the West about them that, has been going on for over a century. And so later on, when I started my PhD with my, it stemmed from my dissertation research. I wanted to direct the dialogue back to Afghans. And so it really started from that place of trying to think about what would be the best medium or approach to get the voices of Afghans and think about, cultural contestations and dynamics and wars, cultural wars that were not being discussed both in academia and in the mainstream media.
Well, that certainly comes through in the entirety of the book. I mean, that foregrounding of an Afghan voice in what is so often, a mediascape that really doesn't value that. And that actually brings me to my second question, which you concentrate on very much in the introduction, and that is your own positionality in the work. I mean, in addition to your filmmaking bona fides with Postcards from Tora Bora, which is a wonderful documentary that I have assigned to my students in the past. We also, you very clearly position yourself as a part of the work. And so I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more, both about your own personal positionality in the work, how that shaped your approach to the work, and just, more broadly, how you think that informs your work.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Another great question. So positionality, I think, is very important, and it's something that when I teach my ethnographic methods classes, I always relay to my students that it's important to be transparent about it. And I'll start by saying, and I think you and other historians and experts on Afghanistan have a type of in-depth cultural knowledge and experience and language skills and so forth, so that you're able to do the kind of work that you do. But for a long time we haven't had that kind of engaged and involved research. And one of the things I noticed, particularly before I went to grad school, when I was a journalist, was the issue of what we called parachuting, when people would come briefly to Afghanistan for a week or two and then become these overnight experts. And that's something, we were all critical of. On the other hand, people like me who straddle both cultures, I consider myself Afghan American, have the cultural fluency both here and over there, but it's been something that's been oftentimes used against us, and it's something I've talked with other people who occupy this bicultural space, which is that we don't have the scientific objectiveness to be able to zoom out and impartially analyze those countries. And so that was something I was trying to destabilize and talk about how it's actually a positive development that more people from those regions are also part of the discourse, right? Engaging with the discourse. And talking about my own family's positionality in terms of involvement in various historical and culturally historic moments. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, I mean, as a reader, one of the things I found so both attractive but also engaging about the way you talked about your own positionality is you do it in a very personal and inviting way, so it really grounds the reader into the story. Yet, with your academic hat on, you really do set it up so that we understand how you fit in the story and how then your position in that story affects it. But I was also really interested to see then, because your main methodology, as you point out in your introduction and follow through, is really an ethnographic one. So given that kind of binational, which is only part of the story as well, because then you go on to talk about something I'd like to talk about earlier, the Kombazi, the ethnicity issue. You really carefully play with that, I think, through your methodology. But I want to use that as an opportunity to give you a chance to talk a little bit about your methodology. Can you tell us, apart just from the structure of your methodology, maybe some of the challenges and opportunities that were presented by your chosen methods, and related to that, your position as both binational, but also within the issue of Kombazi, and also, we haven't brought up one of the central focuses of the work, and that is, of course, gender. So if you can talk about how those all informed your methodological choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think initially, and this ties into both the gender and the Kalmozi aspects that you mentioned. Initially, what I was thinking about was there was so much discourse about saving Afghan women from the Taliban and from other extremist groups, that I wanted to understand the gender and sexuality discourse in Afghanistan itself, right? As opposed to what I've been hearing on the state side. So how do Afghans themselves think about issues of progress and conservatism and extremism and so forth? And so I went in with that lens, but I realized that Kaum or, you know, ethnicity and tribe are also important, and that there is a history and present situation with sectarian tensions and violence. But and that came into play in terms of my method as well, because different media venues are affiliated with different ethnic groups and religious groups and tribes. And so my own family's positionality and, you know, and I come from a mixed Kaum background, came into play as well, because I had to, in order to gain entry into certain sites of research, highlight one side of my family background over another. But I also have to say, I think what was useful for me, and when I came back and started writing the book and analyzing my data, was that I think some of the sectarian tensions and ethnic tensions that I had perceived, you know, in terms of people asking me in depth about my family background and who, you know, what my family lineage was and so forth, that it also had to do with general curiosity. So I had to, when I was writing it, I had to tone some of that back. And I also credit Robert Cruz, Dr. Cruz, who I'm co-writing the Afghanistan Very Short Introduction with, for helping me see some of that I myself was so ingrained into this idea that we're a tribal society and that these tribal issues are very salient. But then in retrospect, I realized that some of it was just general curiosity about, you know, similar to here when you meet someone and you're like, oh, you know, which part of, are you from the Northeast? Are you, you know, that type of thing. But that's not to undermine the fact that, you know, for some groups more than others and some people more than others, it is the primary way that they see their identification.
I mean, I always find it so interesting talking to a fellow scholar of Afghanistan and thinking about, you know, given your position, your identity, your gender, like what doors and open for you, and what venues can you access that I can't, and vice versa. I always find it really interesting to think about that. And you know, obviously my own ethnographic research is limited, but I've done some with Magnus Marston, of course, and I remember very clearly having a clear sense of, you know, these are the lanes that you can go into, and these are the lanes that are closed to you. And I'm sure you had that in a very different way in some of your research as well.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe I'll just touch on that. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
my cell phone, I thought I had it off. But I think you're raising a really good point, is that, you know, in your incredible work, ethnographic work, as you mentioned, that you've done with Magnus Marsden, you know, I think it comes to light that it is a homosocial society, you know, that it is very gender segregated, and that's something that does open doors or close doors. And so I definitely had access to women's spaces and saw a whole world of women's media and women's theater and women's reading groups and all types of things that I think, you know, if I was a male, I would not have been able to be privy to. And likewise, I think, you know, men researchers have access to different spaces. But I think the thing that allowed me to gain access into men's spaces also is because I was not born and raised entirely in Afghanistan, and actually most of my life has been in the US. People saw me as an expatriate, and so it was a different category of allowing me to attend, you know, men-only events in that respect. But yeah, I mean, those are the types of aspects of ethnographic research that you're raising are so important to think about, because people don't think about the difficulties and the challenges of interacting with people, and especially, you know, in a place that's as conflict-ridden and war-ridden as there, has additional challenges.
Yeah, and you bring up the foreigner but not quite so foreign position as well. We've got some great questions coming in. I've got one or two more that I'd like to send your way before I integrate those. Just a shout out to the audience. A couple of you have already put some questions in. Please go ahead and continue to do that. I will integrate those into my discussion here with Wazhmah. I actually want to take the opportunity, since we started to broach the issue of gender, which is really, you know, a core concern of your work. And as you rightly point out, especially in terms of accessing the media landscape and women in the media landscape. I mean, there's a couple of different ways we can take it. I guess one of the things that struck me is, you know, in the beginning, you kind of set up the straw man, which you've hinted at in our discussion thus far, of the international salvation complex, right? The kind of classic white men saving brown women from brown men, Afghan women as victims that need the international community to come save them. And as I wrote to you earlier, you know, this is juxtaposed next to a very different vision of Afghan women that comes up, I think best articulated by Kipling in his Young British Soldier, you know, where he talks about the women coming out to cut up what remains of the young British soldier. So we have these kind of disparate visions of Afghan women, helpless, needing in salvation, or kind of barbaric savages as the Afghans themselves. And yet, as your work, you know, so deftly shows, and as we all know, neither of those really reflect the reality of the lived experience or the historical experience of Afghan women. So I wonder if you could talk about both these kind of archetypal images on the one hand, but also how your work really rebuts nuances and offers a very different image of women and agency in Afghanistan in the media sector.
Yeah, I mean, great question, and it gets at the crux of much of what I was trying to do with the book. And I'll start by saying I think you framed it really well, in that there is this archetypal binary opposition that's set up with Afghan women in Western discourse. As you said, on the one hand, there's the Rudyard Kipling, his famous description, which, you know, most of us are familiar with, and especially historians and archivists like yourself, about the Afghan women who are the same as the rest of the population. They're barbaric, and they, you know, violently tear apart a British soldier. And then on the other hand, you have the other extreme polar opposite, which also has a long history, both colonial and now, you know, I would say neo-colonial or neo-imperial, with the U.S. Forever War there. And that's the victim, you know, the victim idea of the Afghan woman who is in need of being saved by her own brother, and because of the the savagery of the society. And so I knew that that was not the case because I did partially grow up in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so I saw so many Afghan and I would say Pakistani women and other women from the region, Iranian women, who there was such a range of characters in between these polar opposites, right? Who were striving as journalists, as human rights activists, as teachers, as all types of ways that they're trying to work for a better society for themselves and others. And so, you know, that was something that emerges in my book too, is the story of all these women and the work that they do. And I just want to make it clear, it's you know, many of the organizations and women's movements and groups that I worked with and women that I interviewed actually would like to have collaboration with the international community because it brings resources and sheds light on the issues that they're trying to challenge. I think where it becomes problematic is when they're just completely pushed off to the side and not, their voices are not centered in these conversations directly about them. So, you know, and there's truth to the fact that there is a high level of misogyny and misogynistic practices that increased as a result of 40 years of war, and that there are many women trying to challenge that. But I tried to present it in a more, as you said, nuanced light, because having either just the victim trope or the barbaric savage trope is not really useful for moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it just brings to mind so many of the stories that are in your ethnography. At the effect of that 43 years of war. I mean, one of the stories I like best out of your book is the conversation you had with the archivist at Radio and Television Afghanistan, who has this kind of linear memory from the 70s forward, and he himself is the personification of the archives that he's showing you. And also, I should say, you know, one of the real strengths of this work is in your ethnography, you do the best type of ethnographic work as a scholar, in the sense of it's so rich and illustrative and engaging, and it really, even though it's highly personalized, it speaks to the broader point that you're arguing, which is part of the way that this text is so engaging. That said, I actually want to push you a little bit more on this issue of gender. I think it's in chapter 5. You've got some really pithy subheadings throughout your chapters, and I really enjoyed this one that I think just kind of crystallizes this issue. And it's women as projects, the deadly intersection of gender, race, ethnicity, and class. I mean, you just put it all there, you know, in a very nice little heading. And I want to give you an opportunity to maybe pull that apart and deconstruct that for the audience some, because I think there are so many elements that your work addresses with the women as projects and these intersections of different social status and class issues that they're beholden to.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for your kind words, and also for bringing out the intersectional aspects of the book, because it is something that I was very mindful of, because as my research continued, so did my lens beyond just gender and sexuality and kaum or ethnicity, and also taking into account class and socioeconomics. And you know, what I noticed and what I talk about particularly in that section that you mention is that regardless of ethnicity or kaum, that gender and socioeconomics and or class tends to be the more tends to really impact women's lives more. I think that's one way of putting it. And what I talk about is that many of the women who have gone into the media industry across, the different kaums of Pashtun, Tajik, Uzbek, Hazara, and many others, and there's been a huge increase in the number of women. They make up a large percentage of the media sector. That many of them are motivated by having more agency in their lives and having a career and bringing some income into their family, and that a good number of them tend to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And so regardless of which ethnic group they come from, their gender and their class makes them targets for violence and threats, and then that in that way they are unified, because television stations, especially, and media venues more generally, especially the ones that are funded by the international donor community, want to have women on screen. And sometimes they have them off screen too, but they almost want to parade them on TV to say, yes, we are checking the box about gender equality, but that they don't really take into consideration the fact that as they become more high profile, whether it's as broadcasters on television or as hosts of music video shows or all types of other talk show hosts, reality TV contestants, that it also puts a target on them, because the culture has shifted so much to the right and has become much less tolerant for seeing women in public figures as public figures, and that's something that's particular to visual media.
I mean, that precise point really comes out in your discussion of their names are escaping me, but the two finalists from Afghan Star on Tolo, and how you document that Tolo, unlike some of the other news or media outlets, didn't really care about the contestants after the fact, versus some of the other channels did. Actually, that focus on class or socioeconomic position, it brings to mind a follow-up question I have, and that is, often well, maybe I'm admitting my own ignorance or prejudices, but often I think of that as a predominantly urban phenomenon. And yet one of the interesting things that you so well demonstrate and document in your work is that, media, especially television media, is so widespread throughout the country in the rural and urban. And so I actually wonder, is that class issue becoming, as it were, nationalized through television media in a way which it hadn't been? Because one can kind of think of home or ethnicity as the issue of the countryside and class as the issue of the city, and yet very much through your own work we see an intersection of those.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question and comment as well, because we do tend to associate class with the urban spaces, and we imagine, and this is across the board in Afghanistan and here and other places too, we think that residents of urban places are more cosmopolitan and so less provincial in their ideas of their race or ethnicity, or and studies have also shown that they do tend to be more open to marriage across race and ethnicity and so forth, and that class tends to be a bigger divider, whereas in rural areas we imagine, both here in the States and other what we would call first nations of and third world nations, that we imagine rural areas to be more provincial, and people stick more with their lineage groups. And so I think in that respect, something like media in general, and especially media like television and radio, which has the potential to reach the nation, so crosses wider expanses of space, that does converge these ideas. And so class and provincial issues and sectarian issues then become more pervasive. And there's a long history with broadcast technologies, and it's equally true of radio and TV, that they've been used for good nationalist projects, and then they've been used for extremely egregious, national projects, as we know, historically and currently too.
And yeah, and I really appreciate how in the introduction you set up, why the focus on radio and television as opposed to, for instance, social media, looking at the limitations of penetration into the countryside, issues of literacy and such. And the other thing, your answer there about class and our kind of prejudices of urban cosmopolitanism versus rural parochialism, as it were, is challenged by the work of lots of scholars on Afghanistan. I mean, Magnus Marston's Trading Worlds and all the trading, Bob Cruise's Afghan Modern, looking what an incredibly mobile society Afghanistan is, in fact. I want to change the direction and bring in some of the questions we've been getting on the Q&A. Again, to the audience, please go ahead and put those in. I'm turning my attention now. And actually, it's a real pleasure to bring in a question from a affiliated scholar of the Sigur Center, Melanie Sadozai, who's as yourself, a binational French, Pashtun, Afghan, Tajik, who's working on her PhD. And she asks, can you develop more on how you are perceived by Afghans, both as a scholar and not being as from one Qom lineage or part of the country? Or in other words, how do you explain the purpose of your work to those who are not familiar with academics, and how it benefits, in the end, Afghans who are understanding of Afghanistan in the US and West? So I guess kind of a two-part question, one about your binational identity, and two, explaining your work to those outside the academy.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'd love to learn more about Melanie's work, her own work as well at some point. But yeah, I remember one of my earlier trips I made, and my father was partially there with me at times, and he, was like, "Oh, my daughter is studying to be a doctor," and people were very excited, and then I quickly was like, no, not that kind of doctor, and that always makes me think, oh, it's like, it's a great question, is how does the type of academic work we do serve the places that we work on and that we've built our careers around. We obviously wanted to have a positive impact on them, and I think the way I would I would describe to people is that, I'm a researcher, I'm from an American university, and my goal is to try to, as accurately as possible, capture the situation here and bring in as many voices of people into the book as possible. And not just from the elite Afghans who have, more access to Western press and media, but everyday Afghans. And so I think that was something that, takes a while to build those kinds of relationships and trust. But I kept returning to the same organizations and tried to be helpful when I could, and was able to, um, um, manage to do that. And of course, abiding by the customs of hospitality and generosity and all those reciprocal aspects of it helped as well. But of course, it was challenging because, sometimes even I tried to, my language skills are pretty good, and I tried to blend in as much as possible. But sometimes there's still, cross-cultural issues, and I would be perhaps not seen as a local and seen maybe more American. But those are things that we all have to contend with when you're doing that kind of engaged ethnography.
Well, and I don't think you do yourself full justice, Wazhmah, in the sense of, you haven't mentioned the obvious fact as well that Afghanistan is in a state of war, right? There's one image of you with your Kevlar helmet and vest on in the back of a Chinook helicopter as you were flying with Eikenberry, I think it was, to Kandahar for a visit he was doing that you were documenting. And so, I mean, all of those issues that you've so clearly articulated, and then add on top of that the issue of violence and permissibility in doing any of this research, really, which is part of the reason so little of it has been done and why your work is so important.
Thank you.
I want to integrate another question from audience member Daniel Wegeland from Georgetown. And if I can paraphrase it, really asks about, he says, since much of the discussion is focused on the importance of deeper case knowledge and accessing hidden voices, are there any examples of improved policy formulation or implementation resulting from this superior knowledge? So to kind of paraphrase a bit of a utilitarian knowledge question, if this was to be read by a policymaker or something, what can they take away from it to improve outcomes in policy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. And, I think it's something that Ben, you and I and others that we know also are very mindful of how our work is going to be received within policy circles, and, how it can help people make better policy decisions. And so, I mean, if I had to think of, in the interest of time, one takeaway, there's, multiple takeaways in the book that I hope policymakers would heed. But if I had to think of one, I would say to really think about issues of safety and security of reformers, and that's the journalists, media makers, and human rights advocates that I interviewed, and I present their stories in the book because they're doing such incredible work. And this ties to your question too, Ben, about, you've done ethnography in Afghanistan, and it is a war zone, and it's something, I try not to think about, but it has its toll both on the researcher, but more so even on the people who are doing this work that is so important. And they're fighting every day against, the forces of extremism, against the forces of warlordism, both local and international. There's peace activists. There's so many people who are trying to shed light on, various, corruptions and fraud and injustices, and that, there needs to be more done and more attention paid to them by the Afghan government policymakers and the international government policymakers, because they are targeted on a daily basis for the important work that they do. And if they begin to censor themselves more and more, then the culture and society won't move in the direction that I hope it does.
And you really do foreground that in your work. I mean, one of the images I take away from it is you have a juxtaposition of a picture of an ISIS suicide bombing in Kabul in April of 2018, and then on the next page you have the picture of the 9 journalists killed in that instant. And I thought, with your focus on visual media as well, that was just a really arresting juxtaposition in image that I thought was really powerful. I want to bring up another major issue that comes up in your work. You titled the book Television and the Afghan Culture Wars with the subtitle Brought to You by Foreigners, Warlords, and Activists. And there's an absence there that really comes clear in your book that's not in the title that I want to press you on, and that is the diaspora, in the sense that, we've talked about positionality, your own binational identity, and yet many of the key players in your story, not so much the actual faces on camera or in print, but often the players who provide the capital behind these. I mean, you bring up Tolo News, the owner's Afghan American. We have the Australian Afghan diaspora that has been quite important in telecommunications and such. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the Afghan diaspora in the country's mediascape, and more broadly than in Afghan society and politics, and what your work says about that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I could have very easily added, television, the Afghan Culture Wars brought to you by foreigners, warlords, activists, and the diaspora, because diaspora plays such a central role, because the diaspora then does become this bridge between the two worlds. And like you said, they bring so much of the capital and resources, whether now you have Zalmay Khalilzad, who is the liaison between the US government trying to work on the very troubled negotiations with the Taliban, or whether you have the Australian Afghans, the Mohseni family, who run the Mobi Group, who is the parent company of Tolo TV. And you have, French Afghans, and you have British Afghans, and you have so many different Afghans who are there representing one country, but with a foot in the other country too. And so their role is very central to the telecommunication sector, but beyond that, to every sector, to governance and to politics and so forth. And I think with the diaspora, similar to the local population, it's difficult to, and that's something I try to stay away from, is generalizations to, put them all into one category, because there's people similar to the local populations who are doing really incredible work in terms of trying to reform the country and move it out from this 40 years of war and warfare to actually a functioning society. And then you have the other groups of people who tend to be more self-serving and are capitalizing on this, post war reconstruction phase that isn't even very post-war.
Yeah, I mean, that's we could spend another hour just talking about the fall of the diaspora and how that's going to play out. And I know, for instance, Bob Cruz, whom you're working with, you know, he's done such a wonderful job on that. I want to kind of zoom back out as we approach the end of our time together. And I often start with this question, but I think after we've talked about your work, it's actually a better question to have now. And that is, you know, what is your intervention in, with this work? And particularly knowing you mentioned at the beginning that you're also writing the very short introduction to Afghanistan with Bob Cruz. So, you know, that's a very different work. It's a much more panoptical introduction to the field. And it seems like now that you have that knowledge of the field, namely where Afghan studies kind of is broadly, and we have your specific work on television culture, how do you situate your work within that field? And what is the intervention that you are making with this book?
I mean, I think that's a great question to round out this this terrific conversation with, because that's something that you know, ties back in with one of your earlier questions, as well as Melanie's, which is what are the contributions that we want to make, both within academia and more broadly. And you know, I know you yourself are, as you mentioned, I'm working on the short introduction with Robert Cruz, and you're working on the Cambridge overview, historical overview, correct?
Yeah, but we're not going to be competitors. Don't worry. I give you
No,
the field.
no, of course not. No, but I'm saying it's great that you know, these revisionist accounts are going to be out there in the world, because I think then the interventions that I'm making is tied into the interventions that you're making, and other you know, small group of us are trying to make against the dominant discourse, or the more prolific and ubiquitous discourse, which is that for a long time the dominant narrative has been to perpetuate very dangerous stereotypes of people from that part of the world, and that these dangerous stereotypes don't just exist as narratives, but then they have real world consequences on communities everywhere. And it precludes the agency of Afghans for self-determination, for how they want to define their future, and so forth. And so that was one of the main interventions I was trying to do in bringing to light the voices of as many Afghan reformers as I could in the book. And then the other intervention that I think, you know, we're all trying to make is to assess the situation currently. You know, there's a post-colonial discourse that is critical of British colonial discourses that were perpetuated at that time, but not to overlook the fact that we're in a you know, neo-colonial or neo-imperial era, in a sense, with the fact that, you know, some of the US interventions have had positive impacts, but also that in many ways the entanglements that the US is involved in and with other countries has taken what I would argue is an imperial path that is not very different than the imperialisms of the past, and that's something that we you know, in America don't want to contend with. It's something that's like, oh, no, that was the domain of those people did that and those groups did that. But, you know, our work is purely altruistic and for the benefit of humankind, but to really think about what we're doing with these entanglements, and particularly the more egregious military approaches that are less diplomatic and cultural in scope.
You know, and you very nicely and very critically engage in that discussion in your discussion, I think in the third or fourth chapter, about the imperial gaze versus the development gaze, and you do you know, you do a really great job tearing apart that issue of a kind of neo-imperial moment and what it means. But I totally agree with you more broadly that it's a very exciting moment to be a scholar of Afghanistan. There's an amazing amount of incredible literature coming out, which yours is going to be a foundational piece of, and it's so welcome to have.
Yours as well.
But I know we're just about up to time, and I want to give everybody the chance to hear your thoughts about what you're working on next.
Yeah, so thank you. Next, I'm working on a few different projects. So one is the very short introduction that you mentioned that's forthcoming. And then I'm also working on looking at representations and Hollywood of people from that region. And then in addition to that, I'm making a trip, my first trip back in a few years this summer. So I want to look at the follow-up on some of the media developments more and see where there's at. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, when I started my research for this book, it was a number of years ago, and then I subsequently updated it by making follow-up trips. But there wasn't much research out there, particularly of the ethnographic type on media. But I'm happy to say in the last few years, I've heard from a number of newer Afghan American and other bicultural scholars, some Canadian Afghans and so forth, who are doing very interesting research looking into the different media that I discuss in the book much more closely, you know, be it dramatic serials or the influence of reality television, or you know, developments in the internet within the diaspora. And so it's like you said, I think I'll leave it by saying it is an exciting time, and I hope that things improve and more people are able to actually do this kind of engaged work that we do.
Excellent. Well, Wazhmah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat this morning. Everyone, the book is just out with Illinois University Press. It's, of course, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars. I highly recommend it to everyone. As a reminder, we will be posting this interview on our YouTube channel. There's also links on our website to the interview, as well as discount codes from the publisher for the piece. Give yourself an Eid present, because it's well worth it. Give it to yourself, your family. Definitely do take the time to read it. And Wazhmah, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you this morning, and we look forward to your future work.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Great. And everyone, look forward to seeing you to our next New Books in Asian Studies in May, mid-May. I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but Jagjit Lawley will be talking about his new book on the Silk Roads. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll be in touch.